So today's talk is focused on DevOps for all. So the whole purpose of bringing this topic up is typically when we speak about DevOps, we talk a lot about technology and we ignore a few very important aspects of DevOps. So my talk today would primarily focus around that, and this is purely based on my own experiences of trying to roll out DevOps within my teams and within my organization. Okay, so this is a quick introduction about me. I've been in this industry for 17 years. I head the product engineering team. And two things I strongly believe is that technology should be used to simplify things, and the process and technology, they always go hand in hand. You cannot deliver software without having a process around it, and the technology is dependent on the process as well. So today we will take a deeper dive into DevOps and some of the challenges that people face when they actually start getting on board a DevOps initiative. So when we talk about DevOps, this is typically what we actually see or what we imagine. You Google for DevOps, this is the first probably image that you would probably get. So the key takeaway from this image for me is the fact that each process area that we're talking about over here feed into the other with a feedback mechanism. So there is something like when I do code, I have to build, and somewhere that whole cycle goes through and comes back to the code as in the form of feedback. So feedback is a very important aspect as part of DevOps. So this is something probably we all know a lot about, and we've been hearing a lot of talks around this and so on. So I'm not going to get into too much of details about this process per se. But what I would like to emphasize is DevOps is always known as a combination of cultural philosophies, practices, and tools. So this is what we keep hearing when we read about DevOps, when people speak about it, and when we go for any kind of training, right? But what we get in reality is this. So the cultural philosophies and practices get blurred, and the focus is always on the tools. So I'm sure a lot of you attending this session, you've undergone probably some kind of DevOps training where probably the initial bit was all about the cultural philosophies, but the majority of your training sessions or majority of whatever courses that you adopted focused on the tools. Now, the tools are important. Definitely, they are important because they are the ones who get the work done for you. But the whole process of moving into this tool set and getting things done through them is what we need to look at in a little more detail to ensure that you as a DevOps practitioner is successful, right? So one of the key things that I wanted to highlight is those of you who get onto a journey and you are given this title as a DevOps engineer. I think that's something you need to be a little careful about in terms of how you are actually going about things. So if you're just focusing on the tools, you are not going to sustain this whole practice that you're going to set up. Okay. So DevOps is a mindset. So I've got this terminology or these quotes from some of the website. I've given the URLs over here, so you could go and read in more detail about them. But if at a high level, I've just highlighted some of the key words. So DevOps focuses on some key factors. One of them being collaboration. It's very important that we work in collaboration with the other team members. So team members are not just your development teams or your testing teams or your production or operations team per se, but it's a much larger team that you are talking about here, which is what we're going to look at in detail during this talk. And the other thing is about how we understand each other's mindsets and increasing transparency and communication between teams. This is actually very, very important in a DevOps culture. So if you just go back, so many of you have been part of teams where you have a production support team who's separated from you. So you kind of deliver to them and you really don't have that visibility of what goes on in the production environment. But if you have practiced DevOps, you would actually have noticed that the whole process is fundamentally different in DevOps, where you as a developer, you get to see real stats of what is happening in a production environment. The operations team actually has much more visibility on how your code is structured, what is the overall architecture, what are the business cases that your software is actually covering, and so on. So there is much more transparency that comes in, which also is a reason why a lot of people resist practicing DevOps, because they're not used to that kind of openness or open culture or transparency in sharing information between teams. So this is a basic challenge that you need to overcome. Right? So this is a mindset that has to change, and this is something that is very difficult to bring in one shot. So if you look at typical adoption issues for DevOps, you see that a lot of people start by creating a separate DevOps team. Now, that is a fundamental mistake that they're making. So if you look at who knows a system best, it is the set of people who are working on it. So whether it's the development team, the testing team, the operations team, or the business team for that matter, they know those systems best and they know why the systems are structured in a certain way. Now, if you bring in an external team who focuses on DevOps, yes, they will bring in the value of the process and stuff, but they're always going to be challenged by the incumbent team there who would say that you do not know how we work. And then how do you introduce these processes without knowing how we work? So these are typical challenges that people face. And of course, the next 2 points are things that I wouldn't want to discuss too much in detail about the workload. So suddenly you're introducing new tools or new processes, which a lot of people are going to resist. And then very importantly, setting unrealistic goals. So a lot of people in the senior management, they say, okay, let us start with DevOps. And they give you 2 months to say, let's adopt DevOps, and that should be the new way that we work. Now, this is a bit unrealistic because this is a long-term goal, and it is not something that can just be done by installing software. So that's the basic change that we need to think about. But what I will focus on today is the attempting a hybrid model approach. Now, that will never work. And we will look at why it doesn't work as well in a little more detail and look at some solutions to this problem. So what do you mean by a hybrid model? Hybrid model typically talks about how the old world and the new world have to coexist. Now, this is both in terms of people and processes and technology. So there are 3 dimensions here, right? So in terms of people and processes, that's a different approach that you have to follow. And the tech stack that you have, that's a different approach you have to follow, right? So let's look at that a little more in detail. When we talk about DevOps, this is what we believe that we're getting into, right? So we have a DevOps practice, we have a lot of microservices, we have containers, we have applications that run on cloud, and so on, right? So this is the picture that a lot of people paint when they look at working in a DevOps manner. But the reality is slightly like this. So the reality has 2 sides to it. So one, what you see on the left side are the old world or the legacy systems. They still continue to coexist. So these may be very old systems, like something built on mainframes or stuff like that, or even applications that were probably built in the early 2000s or late 90s, which is still considered legacy today because they're not really built to adapt into the new infrastructure or the new virtualized and hardware that we use and stuff like that. On the right side are the new modern age applications, which are meant for mobiles or tabs and the high-end applications that we build today. So the reality in any IT estate is that both these coexist. They have to work together for the business to continue. And if you try to change the stuff on the left side, saying that, no, this is going to give you more benefit and stuff like that, you're going to see a lot of resistance, one from the business owners, because they will look at it as an extra cost that they incur to make these changes. And there is always a risk associated with change. The typical problem of if it is working and not broken, why change? So that is a very difficult problem to get over. And unless they see a real benefit of doing it, they're not going to change. And on the right side, you have ultra modern applications, built using probably what we call the bleeding edge of technology, which can work with this legacy, but then you start hitting performance bottlenecks and stuff like that, which is a whole idea of introducing new technology like microservices and ability to scale up on demand and stuff like that. So as long as you have legacy, you are going to hit problems like this, both from a process and people perspective and from a technology perspective. So this is the reality that we all live with. Some of us are lucky to be working in new age companies where everything has been started from ground up. So it's quite easy to kind of model your processes and your tech stack on the latest trends and what is there. But in terms of the overall reality of how typical businesses work, the reality is that you have old world systems that you're going to deal with. So today we look at a little more in detail how we can handle these kind of issues. So the biggest issue that you're going to challenge is bringing them all together. And you need to understand that there are different groups of people, the multiple groups of people who are involved in this process. So there is a set of people who fund the project. So they're the typically the business guys. So if you're looking at a startup kind of a culture, the investors or the people who have who give you the ideas that you're going to build. In a typical IT setup and IT services world, you have people who are the business owners of the system. They decide how the business is going. They come up with the new requirements and stuff like that, right? So they're going to fund the projects. And then, of course, we have the typical delivery team from design to the support team and the users of the product, the end users or the customers of the product or the service that you're building, right? So they all need to come together in a much better manner for you to have an understanding of how these processes need to evolve. The technology stack that you're talking about is within your control, within your development team, within your testing team, within your operations team, and so on. But the end product is going to be used by a business user or by the end customer, and they are not in your control. So that is something you need to be very cognizant about when you actually bring up these changes. So if you have to look at a typical example that I wanted to take, we all make choices. So so a lot of us have been constrained to our homes in the last few months because of the pandemic and the issues around it. So we've tried to recreate a lot of the experiences that we get in a restaurant, right? So when we have to make a choice between home and restaurant, what is it that we choose? So typically a lot of people say I would go with home food and so on. But no, I'll just twist that a little bit and ask the question in a different manner. Would you ever go to a restaurant if you had a bad experience there? Obviously, no. Would you also eat home cooked food if your preferences are not considered, right? So these are two very important aspects that play a very silent role in your choices or a choice that you make. So what is the difference between these two? It is the experience that you're getting. The experience is a key difference between what you like to do and how you do it. So similarly, when you're trying to bring in a DevOps culture into your organization, into your teams, the experience that people get out of it is what is going to determine whether it is going to be successful or it is not going to go ahead for a long time. This is where I wanted to just take a small diversion. This is not about software. This is around a problem solving technique. I will not go deep into it because this itself is a very vast topic itself, but I just wanted to bring to your notice, and there are some tools or techniques that you can adapt into your organization or into the way that you're rolling out DevOps. So this is an example of what happened in PepsiCo, and this is a quote from their CEO, Indira Nui. All of you have heard about her, obviously. So long back, they have a brand called Sun Chips, which is quite popular in the US, and they ran into a problem that their sales dipped. Now, when they did a lot of analysis, and this is a very detailed case study, which you can just Google and you will get details about it. So when they did a lot of analysis, they found that the problem that why customers did not like the Sun Chip was actually because of the size of each of the chips that was being made. It was too big, and when they took a bite of it, it was crumbling and falling. And they had alternatives which are smaller and fitting them much better. So they made a choice, and this is a very subconscious thing. Nobody really measures the size of a chip and decides, okay, I'm not buying Sun Chip, right? But it's purely an experience that they've got, and based on which they have actually made a choice. So they solved the problem by making the size of the chip smaller. So that's all it takes. If you identify the root cause of the problem, the solution is always very simple. So that is all I wanted to cover in this one slide. And that's where I wanted to introduce a question to you. What have you done as a DevOps engineer or as a DevOps practitioner to create an experience where people would like to embrace DevOps, right? So you can talk to them all day long in terms of the time to market and the cost benefits and the speed of delivery, yes. But the obvious question that everyone would ask is, what is it in for me, right? So that is something that you need to define, and that is something, once you define and people understand, they will get onboarded with you, right? This is where I wanted to introduce a term called design thinking. I'm sure many of you have heard this, some of you are already practicing this, but this is a very effective way of rolling out changes. So design thinking can be applied in any walk of life. The PepsiCo example that I took, that also is an example of design thinking. You can apply it in software designing. You can define it in organizational change and so on. It is just a human-centric approach for solving problems. And the really important point I wanted to highlight on design thinking is how it bridges the gap between something that just works and how it actually solves a real problem. So when something works, people are fine with it, but when it really solves a problem, the kind of reception that it has is much better. So that is the fundamental change that design thinking brings in when you apply it into problem solving or into solving your problems. This is something that is really worthwhile, and that is something that has really worked for me within my team and my organization in terms of approaching how we have rolled out DevOps practices. This is something a lot of you have heard about when during your DevOps sessions or whatever trainings that you have done, or when you try to do it. So shifting left. So I mean, just in case somebody is not aware, the whole process is identify processes that can be performed earlier. So that is the basic principle of DevOps. Move things and let them fail as early as possible. Right? So that's why we start introducing a lot of testing during the development phases. We try to automate the tests so that people can typically have a basic round of testing done before it actually goes to a testing phase or into a validation phase or even into production, right? So do it as early as possible is the basic principle here when we say shift left. Now, how often do we apply this in areas outside the core development or testing principles is something that we need to ask ourselves. So these are typical areas that we look at working on in DevOps. So we have design, we have development, we have infrastructure automation, we have test automation, security, monitoring automation, and the overall workflow and what are the set of processes and what feeds into the other stuff that we typically look at in a DevOps practice, correct? So have we considered the infrastructure during design? So these are important questions that we need to start asking. So what I started noticing, so a few days back, I was actually having a discussion with one of my team members, and they as developers, they were a little worried about the runtime environment. But what did happen, some of the designers, they had not considered the actual runtime environment where the product was going to run. So they did not consider certain aspects of high availability. They did not consider certain aspects of scaling. They did make some assumptions on the infrastructure, but the actual infrastructure where it was going to run and the ones that they assumed were slightly off target. So when it actually went live, we hit a lot of issues in terms of performance and scaling. So this could easily have been avoided had the infra related requirements been documented and shared right up front and been agreed upfront, saying that, okay, this is where the product is running today. So any design changes that you bring onto the table has to factor in this before we make any changes to the overall system design or we introduce any new feature to the product, right? So this is information that is readily available. And this is exactly where I was talking about in terms of communication, collaboration, and transparency. In an old school mechanism, though the development teams were consulted in terms of the infrastructure requirements, it was more the operations team who was managing it. And the development team at times were not even aware of some kind of operational or the operating system patches that are applied, or in terms of certain downtime that is there, etc. But if you look at a typical DevOps model, as a developer, I would actually have dashboards where I can see the memory utilization of my process, where I could actually see how much of this storage is used. Though I don't have access to the environment, I get information about all this. And this allows me to factor in these details. So there is a lot more transparency between what is happening in production and what is happening in design as well. So we are inviting the operations team, we are inviting the development team and the design team into discussions so that people can brainstorm together. The perspectives that they bring in are going to really be life-changing or life-saving for you in many times. Another key important or key aspect over here is the security aspect. I know that today morning there was a session on DevSecOps, which is very important. What happens today is a lot of people consider security as a side track. They say, okay, I will design my application and I will pass it by the security team for their approval, expecting it to fly through. But today, especially today, when a lot of people are working offline, a lot of the businesses are actually targeting an online model because that's the only way they can sustain. Security has become a very, very important concern. So we've heard enough about it, we have read enough about it. So we cannot sideline them. So inviting them as early into the software process as possible is very key. So right from when a business requirement is identified, I would believe that the security team has to get involved in identifying whether that requirement itself can be allowed to go ahead. So today we live in the era where data is defined as the new oil, right? So there have been a lot of lawsuits filed against companies. People are actually bleeding money because of data losses or privacy concerns that are being raised by people. So it is very important that you engage your security team as early as possible to even validate whether the requirement that a customer has raised or the business team is wanting to implement is something that is allowed. So there's no point designing it, implementing it, and then passing it to the security team probably even after testing and then saying, no, sorry, we can't allow this to go ahead. So that's why that early engagement allows you to reduce your overall costs. I mean, that's a basic principle of DevOps, right? So the whole point I'm trying to drive over here is that the more we engage people, the better our solution is. And how do we engage people? It is through the processes that we have. So the more we talk about tech stack, yes, there is a tech stack for automating designs. You have a lot of low code drag and drop interfaces that you can use. You have automation for build using Gradle, Maven, and a lot of other tools that are available today. We have infra automation, we have test automation. All these are available today. But how do we stitch them together is the key. So we will look at how we can actually adapt a DevOps practice or a DevOps culture for legacy IT. So most of us are familiar with how we do it for the new age technology, right? But what about the legacy? How do you get these old world systems and the people and the processes that exist for legacy onboarded? So the first principle that I tend to follow is follow the continuous integration approach. Change it bit by bit. Don't introduce drastic changes. They're never going to get accepted. What we need to do is we need to do it step by step, introduce changes in small bits and pieces so people find it easier to accept. So instead of going and telling them that, okay, we're going to stop what you're doing, we'll change our processes a bit by bit. So even within my own team, what we did is we had a typical waterfall model earlier, and we wanted to slowly get into an agile model. So instead of one big bang change, which I tried and it failed in a 3-month period. So what we then started practicing is I kind of split my teams, and for my testing team, I gave them a small target saying that you should, going forward, any new tests that are created should be automated. For my development team, I give them a target that going forward, any unit, any new module that you are creating should have an automated unit test. And over the last 18 months or so, we've actually managed to cover our entire applications with unit tests and a lot of automated tests from our testing team. And what we're doing today is we've actually applied that shift left principle, wherein the testing team's tests are now being actually applied or run by the development team itself much earlier than you would actually imagine, in the sense that these tests were typically being applied and they were run by the development team to uncover a lot of issues or uncover a lot of potential bugs that could have been caught much later and have been expensive to fix, right? The other thing is automate as is when possible. So this might be a challenge for some of the legacy applications, but what we need to understand is software was meant to automate manual tasks. So now we are talking about automating software itself, right? Automating a build process or automating something else or automating the testing. So we are looking at automating software today. So we've actually evolved from automating mundane manual tasks to automating automated mundane tasks, right? So it is very important to understand that every programming language or every framework that we had always had interfaces that could allow it to automate stuff. So what are these things? Depends on the tech stack that you use. Now, if you're talking about, say, something like as old as mainframe or an application that is written in the old world Java, there are interfaces that they expose. It is how efficiently we understand and latch onto these interfaces and automate it is what is critical. So just to give an example, sometime back, somebody kind of challenged me saying that I have a mainframe process. Tell me how I can build a DevOps model around it. So we spent some time. So as an organization, we have our products and tool sets that we also commercially sell for customers. So we kind of applied some of these tool sets and we built a wrapper around the mainframe system where the mainframe's capabilities, we started exposing them as microservices. Yes, you heard that right. A mainframe's capability exposed as a set of microservices. And this is not something that we have done ourselves. There are a lot of companies out there who have done this and we've been quite successful in doing that. And the moment I had these microservices, we were able to bring in these DevOps practices on top of it as well. We also made them change the way the new requirements were getting implemented into the mainframe systems. So there was a different kind of a process that was added. There was a different methodology that was followed. And in due course of time, people were adapting that as well, because they started seeing the benefit of having that mainframe's capability, to say create a customer account or do things around that available on a mobile app, which was a distant dream for them until some time back. So there, and what did we do? We used what was already there. We didn't bring or we didn't tell them to rewrite the entire mainframe software. All that we did is we said, okay, we will reuse existing interfaces that mainframe exposes. So mainframe had exposed interfaces to publish files via FTP or message queues and stuff like that. So we built wrappers around that to get this done. And then the wrappers were actually built in modern technology, which could help us go around bringing out these DevOps practices. We could automate tests. So whenever a new change was rolled out on the mainframe side, we obviously had a corresponding change on the microservices layer as well, which we could automate and validate the change on the mainframe side as well. So we need to start thinking out of the box here to see how these practices can actually be implemented. And one very, very important aspect, migrate only when required. Don't try to enforce migration steps on people, because there's going to be a lot of resistance. So when we introduce change, we need to be very conscious that software has two parts to it. It's the process and the technology, like I mentioned in the beginning. The process is something that we typically ignore, and we look at focusing on the technology, and that is where we fail typically. So I'm again trying to emphasize on the point that don't look at software in isolation. The technology and the process have to go together if you have to have a meaningful change that you can introduce. So when we bring a DevOps practice, I think we need to start from the beginning. So we need to have well-defined roles and responsibilities for each individual. A lot of you must be wondering, as a DevOps engineer, how does it matter, right? So unless you have a well-defined boundary between you and the other practitioner, they're going to feel threatened. They're going to feel that no, we have a new person or a new team who's coming in with some new age process, and my job is threatened. Probably I might become redundant and stuff like that. So it is very important to bring them on board and say, okay, yes, there are going to be some changes, but this is your new role. So we are actually giving you the confidence that you're going to learn something new, and you're very much part of this process change, right? We have to define rules of engagement. So when do I involve whom? So I can't say that the design team is always involved in every production issue, right? We need to say when they get onboarded. Yes, we do have calls where all of them are involved, but who is the primary point of contact? How do we engage them? What are the interfaces that we can use to share data, etc.? All these have to be well defined. Another thing is pre-mortem. So we all know what post-mortem is. After something has happened, we look at it, and that's how we typically behave. But we need to start understanding this whole term called pre-mortem, where we kind of brainstorm. We get all the stakeholders together, whether it is the business users, whether it is the customers, whether it is the design, development, architecture team, or the operations team, or the testing team. Get all of them together on a regular basis, go through what they're doing, understand if they see any issues, and the perspectives that they bring onto the table. Trust me, it's going to change your life. It's going to make things much easier, because a lot of scenarios that you would have thought about, a lot of ways in which you would never have thought about your software being used, are going to be brought up by these people who you have ready access to. And that is the basic principle of DevOps, right? More collaboration. Another aspect is retrospectives. Plan for regular meetings where every month, every 2 weeks or every week, you meet up, you kind of understand what is happening, and you have clarity in terms of what has happened and what has been going well and that is not being going well. So this is a typical agile practice, right? So we have these stand-up meetings and the sunset, sundown meetings, something on these lines, but maybe the frequency is a weekly one or a bi-weekly one, but it is very important. So all these are ways in which you bring people on board. So this is a term that I have coined called design ops. So what I wanted to do is, when we design software, it is very important to get feedback early. And the moment you touch upon the word prototype, a lot of people think I have to build something that actually can be demonstrated to people, right? So this is again not really required. So test early and get feedback is something all of us believe in, all of us understand very well. But how do we do this testing? Well, this is a very easy way. This is also a prototype. You just draw stuff on paper, take it to people. The image actually gives them a lot of information in terms of how something works. So this is something that we follow very meticulously. At least when we were all in office, we used to use a drawing board. We used to get a lot of people together from different areas. We used to make them understand the whole process rather than just talking and having a lot of words written in a document and being mailed across. This actually gives perspectives to people. We try to get some of our operational guys also into this meeting as much as possible, and they give some perspective. So this is around some UI designs that were being done at this point in time, and we got a lot of stuff in terms of how some of the users were struggling with some of the issues that were there. One point that all of us need to understand is what is important. So we talk about tools in a DevOps manner. The tools are definitely important. Yes, as I said in the beginning, the tools are the ones that are going to do all the heavy lifting of work, right? But is it the tool or the result that is really important? Right? So if we focus on the result, then our perspective on things change. And that is the basic problem that I see with a lot of people who become these so-called DevOps engineers or DevOps practitioners, where they're focused on implementing tools or things that they have learned as part of their whole process of education. But what they are forgetting is the fact that the result is what really matters. So maybe you don't need a tool that you're talking about. So we hear about a lot of tools. Like we hear the moment we talk about DevOps, people talk about Jenkins, people talk about Ansible, Chef, Puppet. They talk about Spring Boot and stuff to build your microservices. They talk about containerization, Kubernetes, and stuff like that. But are all these required? As I mentioned earlier, change only when needed. So if there is something that is working beautifully, there is only a question of using that in a slightly different manner, changing your process or adapt process, then go for that. The tool becomes irrelevant because the result is what really matters there. So moving on, So what I would suggest is you should let people make the choice of tools. So you give them. So as a practitioner of DevOps, as somebody who has information about the kind of tools that are available, you present that to them and let them make the choice in terms of the tools that they want. So that gives them more comfort. It helps them solve a problem better, right? Insights, and they feel they are part of this whole process of change that is being rolled out in their teams or within their organization, right? So that comfort opens people up and makes this whole adoption much better. So that is at a high level what I wanted to cover in terms of the processes aspect. And as I said in the beginning, the feedback. How do you gather feedback whether all these changes are actually working out for you guys? Do you have implicit and explicit feedback gathering mechanisms? So if I have to give an example, if you ask somebody, what is your feedback on this new DevOps process? They'll look, okay, who's asking this? My manager. And I cannot say it's bad, right? So I'll always say, yeah, it's working wonderfully. But within me, I have 1,000 points where I'm unhappy about what is changing. And that is actually not coming out in this whole process. So it is very important that we have implicit and explicit feedback and try to make sure that these two are aligning to each other. Right? So it is that entire feedback loop that we saw in the DevOps process is something that we need to engineer into it. So it's not just the tools, how we use the tools and how we gather feedback from the tools in terms of their efficiency and in terms of efficiency of the process itself is very important when you're building a whole DevOps ecosystem. So that's pretty much what I wanted to cover. And in terms of a summary, what I would like to tell everyone is don't just learn the tools. Okay, understand why the tools are required, where the tools are required, and then give the choice to the users in terms of the tools that you want. Enforcement is not always a nice way to roll out things. Let them adopt, give them enough time, and be realistic in terms of the timelines that you're looking at in terms of tools or technology or changes being adopted by people. Adopt step-by-step approaches. So make sure that you bring in small changes over time so that people can understand it better. And any day, I would like to just say that choice is a better way of rolling out things than enforcement.